technology works. Lovely to see you all, and thank you so much for all of your attendance. I'm really very grateful that so many of you decided to give up parts of your afternoon to come and watch and listen to me. And I hope I don't disappoint you. As Andrea said, I come out of the management part of the work rather than from the HR part. I was CEO. I started off actually as a journalist in the bad old days in South Africa until I was thrown out of there in the 80s, and then came into television and radio in the UK, and climbed up in management, and then ran various technology and media companies until I gave that up and went into coaching. What you're seeing here in the first slide is basically just if you the sort of the work, some of the works that I'll be referring to or being influenced by, if you like. And if you want me to put that up at the end, please don't hesitate to ask. The agenda today is basically, I'll be in 3 sections. One is looking at power and what it is and why I do believe it's absolutely important and it's crucial. Then my research and how I went about looking at how leaders learn to use their power, when and how they learn to use their power and authority. And then finally into the portion where I will be talking about how this has influenced my coach mentoring, and how it basically I've developed a particular style of coach mentoring, particular approach to coach mentoring that I call the partnering stance coach mentoring. I find it quite interesting, and I always have, that when we're talking about leaders, particularly about leaders, when we're coaching and choosing leaders, the one thing we do not directly ask is, how will those leaders, when they take office, actually exercise their power and authority? And why will they do so? What assumptions do they come into office with? What filters do they view their world? What are they actually saying about the way that they regard the world, and therefore how they're going to exercise their authority? We tend, I believe, to choose our leaders blind. And I mean blind and blindly. We look at them from the outside. We say, okay, do they have qualifications? Do they have the qualifications? By the way, the higher they get, as you know, the less we look at the qualifications. Because it seems that there is a school of thought that says if you can lead a large banking institution, you can probably lead a large technology institution. But the qualifications become less and less important. And the experience is the other one, where of course we choose leaders by experience. And experience, again, is the experience of leading organizations and the type of organizations, rather than the experience of how they have exercised their leadership. We still have these areas in terms of referrals that organizations like to choose people that have been referred to them, that they know. And then there is this rather insidious thing that I certainly discovered, and I don't know if you have, where there is the loyalty factor. Shareholders, boards tend to like to appoint people who they know will be loyal to their interests. And then finally, there's this funny thing, of course, called charisma. People like to choose leaders who look like leaders, who feel like leaders, who sound like leaders, lead from the front or whatever they do. But all of these things are choice. We choose leaders from the outside. We know very little about these people. And we coach leaders. We tend to coach leaders in very much the same way. We tend to coach leaders to change behavior. question is, from what to what? And why? And in one context? And will one context actually apply to the other? We tend to I see quite a lot of meetings and courses on the various coaching association sites and various, adopting, being a leader with compassion, being a leader who's inclusive, being a coaching style leader. In what context? And what are we asking these leaders to be when we coach them? Are we asking them to mime being a good leader? Are we asking them to adopt the role of being of a particular leadership style? We're not looking at context. We're not looking at where these people are coming from. We're not looking at the assumptions that they're making. So what is power? Why do I think it's so important? I've taken power as, quite simply, the capacity to act or to affect action within a context. It comes from the old French word pouvoir, basically to act, to do. Power is always generates action. It's not there, it's not exercised to sit on it. It's exercised to generate action or to influence action. And unlike, for example, Hannah Arendt, who talks about that she feels that individuals don't have power, Hannah Arendt talks about it, only blocks can have power. I believe very much like Foucault that it is ubiquitous, and it can be exercised both as influence as an individual basis. And of course, as leadership, more power, the leaders have significant capacity through the authority of office that is granted to them. So they have quite a wide-ranging power, whether it is by inference or actuality. I do believe that power and authority, whether at work or personally, is the most significant indication of our relationship to our world, about how we feel about our fellow human beings. If you think about it, how I try to get you to do something, the manner in which I do that indicates very strongly what I feel about you. Whether I feel the respect for you, whether I feel you are my opponent, whether I feel you are my ally, whether I feel you are my equal, it is a significant way of doing so. Whether I am doing and enacting my own power by doing things or getting you to do so, it is always done within a relationship of some kind. And it does, as I said, indicate that strongly what I feel about you. Power, as far as I'm concerned, is very much relational. It always exists among and between, and it is never absolute. Even total dictators will always have to negotiate or mediate relationships within their context. So they always have to have that power among, if you like. Very much saying the same thing there. The assumptions, therefore, that we have about our world and about our fellow beings and about the relationships we have with them about power are learnt. That's the good thing about them. They're learnt. They're not inherited. They're learnt. And of course, because they're learnt, they can be unlearnt or relearnt. So moving on to how I started to research this, how leaders learn to exercise power. I initially set out to find, and I won't go into too much of it, but I initially set out to find basically very general thing: how do top leaders experience their learning? How do they grow and develop while in office? How do they manage? While they're under fire? Why do they have certain people have certain sexual interests, certain people don't? how do they learn, experience their learning while they're in office? It turned out to be a completely, the question turned out to be slightly different after that. Again, so that we don't risk you going comatose, I won't go too much into it, but I used constructivist grounded theory rather than ordinary grounded theory. So basically, not Glaser, because what I was very much aware of, and what I was very much a follower, was that yes, I wanted the data to come from the research participants, but I wanted to be absolutely alert, and I wanted to alert also my participants that I did not come there as a neutral entity. And therefore, I needed to keep this dynamic tension between selecting and creating theories, if you like, and making sure that between that and also getting what they were trying to say to me out of it. So therefore, I did construct the theories, but they were always, it was always validated. They always worked with the researcher, with the participants. I used 10 leaders all in all. All of them, as it turned out, were objectively successful people and had done particularly good things in their organizations. There were 3 of them were in the education field. There was 2 basically vice chancellors or principals or presidents of universities. 2 of them were in the US. One of them was EU based, and there was also a school principal who had also been immensely transformational in education in the UK. At one stage, ran a school which had something like 55 different languages, of immigrant languages, which he transformed from being the worst performing school in the country to one of the best. 4 military generals, forget all about the two-star Stanag nonsense. They were all major generals, all 3 stars. 3 of them were in the UK, and one of them was a German Luftwaffe general, and they were all men. And finally, corporate CEOs all had global reach, if you like. 2 women, 1 man. The women ran an international charity. She was North American head of an international charity, and the other one was a international CEO of a global bank, and the man was a media and technology CEO who ran the first split headquarters of a media and technology company based in Beijing and in Holland, and he based himself in Beijing. The conditions were quite firm, and we agreed to them right at the start. I wanted anonymity. I particularly wanted anonymity because, as you know, when you read autobiographies, when you hear people telling you their stories, they want to have their stories as a coherent narrative. They want to make sense, if you like, of their lives. So they really are very reluctant, if they are exposed and in public, they're very reluctant to be able to allow themselves to show the messiness, the vulnerability, the chaos sometimes of their lives. So that's what I wanted to avoid. I wanted that messiness. I wanted to see them to be able to talk to me safely. So there was strict anonymity, and that anonymity continues to this day. Some of them were very happy to make their names public, and I particularly asked them not to. This one, I think they didn't quite realize how much it was. the commitment of time, and the commitment of time over the 3 years of the research and the and working through was that I needed them to really come back and engage and validate the process all the time. So every time I did and I'll just move on to so you can see the sort of stuff that we did here. Every time I did an interview and transcribed it, it had to be validated. Every time when we started the coding and we started the initial coding and the theming, sent them to them saying, this is what I've got. Are you, do you want to comment on that? Do you want to change that? Do you have any thoughts to have on that? So they spent a large amount of time working with me, making sure so that I could make sure that at the end of the day, when we got to the constructing the theories, it came from them. They didn't feel that they were being pushed into it at all. Again, I won't go into it, but it was a massive amount of data, as you can imagine. At some stages, I felt I was actually sitting like a chicken on eggs, on her eggs, just sitting there, just immersing myself in the transcripts, going in and doing the coding, thinking about it, going out again. And it took a long time. Some of those interviews I sat on for months, so that we could actually get the proper response out of it. The fascinating thing was, and this is what I'm saying, that somehow the treasure is not what you think it is. The fascinating thing was that although I went in wanting to see what their experience of learning was, how they experienced the learning while they were in power, they kept on, when I was interviewing them, they kept on throwing open sort of windows like, well, said the school principal. Of course, my big moment, the big thing happened when I was a child, when I was put into a special needs class. The university president said to me, kept on throwing up and said, of course, that came from my childhood, that my mother always said I could cure cancer at 4. Or that came from my childhood when my mother used to send me to haul my father out of the pub. So that they kept on throwing these windows open to their childhood. And the interesting thing that I found was that although when I talked to them about their current work or the work then when they were adults, it was interesting. It was quite thin. There's very little emotion involved. When they talked about their childhood and they talked about the developmental stage of their childhood, they started getting quite emotional about it. And one can understand that, of course, because that's when emotions are most deeply embedded. So here's what we came up with. Here's what the finding summary. I mean, following on Keegan and Piaget, the basis was that in our childhood exploration, we learn to differentiate ourselves from our world in order to survive and then to progressively learn to act. So it's not much different from Piaget's development stages. And Keegan talking about that balance that the child is always seeking to be between being overwhelmed and drowned by the world on the one hand, keeping that middle ground between that, and on the other hand, being isolated and lonely. So it's that making space for themselves within the world that we were talking about. What we discovered, the participants and I discovered, is that these leaders had formed foundational assumptions about their relationships with their world, and specifically about the power balance they held with their world. This assumption I call the navigational stance, because it was the sort of angle of entry that they had into the world. And those that had an imbalance assumption, an assumption of imbalance or asymmetry, if you like, with their world, and I'm saying their world, not their world, always their world, they form what I call an oppositional stance to the world. And if you think about it, if I have more power than you, or I believe I have more power than you, or I believe I have less power than you, there's always going to be an oppositional approach. We are not partners, because I know that if I have less power than you, that at some stage you will be able to knock me down. At some stage you will be able to take advantage. These leaders, however, formed a partnering stance. They all, despite the fact that some of them had particularly difficult lives, they all saw the world as a pretty manageable place. They all felt that they could maneuver. They all had plan A, plan B, plan C, and plan D. They could work with what they had. They could do business with their world. And that's, by the way, hence why the book is called How They Do Business with Their World. And it's probably the worst title I could ever think of, because people come to me and say, isn't it a book about business? No, it's about doing business with your world. And they went on throughout their lives and consolidated this partnering style, because they saw it as a massively useful tool with a set of sub-assumptions and tools which they continuously honed. They developed and honed and strengthened. And you could see it. It was an ongoing thing that they did throughout their lives. And this I call their navigational compass. You can say I'm not particularly imaginative. Partnering, oppositional, and navigational compass. And I'll just give you a couple of thoughts and a couple of examples here. So pragmatism is basically, we defined as do the best you can, do the best possible until the possible isn't best. And then, if necessary, change the possible. So in order not to be entirely trite, let me give you an example. One of them was the German Luftwaffe general, who, when he was a child, used to, because his father used to change jobs all the time, he went to something like 7 schools within his first 6 or 7 years of schooling. And of course, because he was always in a strange place, he was subject to bullying. He was a perfect bullying target. And he was also, as he said, rather sickly. So what he used to do is he used to do deals. And what he did, he used to do it, he used to arrive at school, find the strongest boys, and basically say to them, tell you what, you look after me and I'll help you do your maths. I'll help you do your lessons. Basically, he was clever, so that's what he did. And this worked. This was the best possible, and this worked until one day a new school arrived late, and somebody had done exactly the same thing, and had worked this one out and done exactly the same thing. So by the time he arrived, the deal had been done with somebody else, and he now was going to be bullied by the new kid. So he thought, I'm going to have a problem with this, because if I am going to be bullied by the new kid, I've got no leverage. He's as clever as I am. I've got to do something. So I said, what did you do? Did you go and negotiate? He said, no, I hit him. I hit him. So don't try this at home. I hit him. So I said,
all you need to do is just piss.
Sorry, say again.
Sorry, that was a disturbance. Carry on, Stephen.
Okay. So he basically smacked him, which stopped the bullying, but also he changed the possible. It's a crude way of showing that he did what he could up to the moment he could, and then after that, he realized he had no alternative but actually to change the possible. And that's exactly what he did. Do the best possible until the possible isn't best, and then change the possible. Socializing decisions. The woman who was the president of or the chief executive of the global charity, this will take socialized decisions as well as holism. She took over this charity, which was in dire financial straits, and it really was. It was an existential financial strait. She took it over, and she realized quite quickly that what was happening was that it was going to go down the drain, and it was one of the most sort of loved, venerated charities that the world had, and it was going to go down the drain. So she realized that its biggest problem was the way it was structured. It was so expensive because it was federal, but at the same time, all the chapters, all the local areas, all had a say in how to do things. So that meant, in fact, that it became enormously expensive to make any changes. There were, each one had a board, and each one replicated in each particular area. So she drew up a blueprint and presented it to the board, and the board then went slightly nuts for about an hour or so, but then eventually the chairman said to them, look, I think they see the point. Why don't we put it to the vote, and you will win the vote. And she realized at the time that this wasn't going to work. She realized at the time that this was the way this organization had been structured was actually deeply embedded into its culture, and that's what made it so loved. And she realized then that she had to then go and do something about it. So what she did, she embarked on a year-long practice of socializing, of calling people in and getting them to make the decisions and saying, these are the issues. So she really went through right down to the lowest level. She called up meetings within the local towns. She socialized this entire thing, delayed the changes for nearly a year, because she understood that unless she could see the context, which is what that holism is about, this organization, yes, she could have changed it, but she would have killed it as well. She would have killed its spirit as well. And that came from, just the echo, came from when she was, one of the things that she learned when she was a child was her parents were very good at debating with her. So basically she grew up with the assumption that as long as you were able to put forward a good argument, she would get what she wanted. She could make space for herself. The problem with that is that she then also assumed as a child that everybody could do that. And when she discovered, and she started therefore evolving at school into being a bit of an alpha bully, because she assumed that everybody could do that, until somebody turned up who was more of an alpha bully. And she realized then, and she made some very straight decisions, and that guided her throughout the rest of her life. She realized then that actually to assume that everybody could do what she could do was a total mistake. So she moved away from that. And that's where she had learned, if you like, to understand context and understand assumptions. The third one I just wanted to take, because I don't want to take up too much of that time. The third one I want to talk about is basically triangular challenges. All of these leaders made sure that they had three things: that they challenged themselves, they deeply reflected and challenged themselves, that they challenged other people, and that they set up structures for other people to challenge them. The college president in the US, who I called Melissa, when she took over that college, she used to deliberately go and look for challenge and set up structures in which she would deliberately go and look for challenge from people right outside her circle. She was terrified of, as she called it, falling captive to the circle, to the inner circle. The interesting thing about that for me was that as she got after about 5 or 6 years, she said to me, I found this whole process of looking for challenge, looking for people, looking for critique from people who were naturally opponents of hers, if you like. She found that so exhausting that she started finding herself retreating into the circle, which became a safe haven. The result of that was that she started getting ambushed. She started getting ambushed from people because she was no longer getting that, no longer being in touch with what was going on within the college. Moving just along, and I realize I'm skimming surfaces. How has this influenced my coach mentoring? For a start, since I completed that research, and I continue to do that research, by the way, I continue to do that research now with clients with their permission. I do not now, I'm particularly aware of the requirement for holism and understanding context and text within my coaching. I very rarely, in fact, I don't coach piecemeal. People will say to me, can we get you to coach this person to change their behavior, or coach this person to reach this particular target? I don't do that. I say I will do that, but I need to do it from the perspective of what is their attitude, what are their assumptions that they're coming into the world, particularly their power assumptions. So the process becomes quite simple, if you like, in that way. I go, what are your outcomes? What outcomes do you want to achieve? What outcomes do your manager want to achieve? Then I do the in-depth interview, which is very similar to that data, that grounded theory interview, which lasts about 3 hours, which I then analyze, and then I deliver. Then I also do a benchmark with a navigation compass with them. And then we do an analysis and feedback, and that analysis and feedback is a dialogue. It's a dialogue of equals, in which, and that's where I talk about it. I'll talk about it a little later on. It's massively important. I found it very important that during that feedback, that they really do critique what I'm saying about them. They really do. If they feel in any way they disagree, they tell me, and it's removed from the feedback, because it has to resonate with them. Because if it doesn't, if they don't agree, we're not working as partners within it. And then I look at how it impacts the outcomes, and we prioritize and coach to develop effective partnering. The central point that I make about my coaching, about the coaching style arising from the navigation stance, is that it is entirely wasteful and quite silly, I think, not to use the resources that you have available to you. And those resources that people have is those within their world, of the people, the relationships, the attitudes, the tools they have within their world. If you are not partnering with your world, if you're spending your time defending yourself against your world, even if you are at the top of the tree, even if you are the leader of the organization, you're wasting a huge amount of resource. And you're also making sure that you're missing alertness. You tend to start not quite understanding that the people you're dealing with are sentient beings. David Bohm talks about it, the nuclear physicist, who was also an extraordinary philosopher, talks about it when he says, when we are dealing with people, when we negotiate, and we negotiate on the basis of pros and cons, rights and wrongs, we never really reach agreement. Somebody may win and somebody may lose, but we never really reach agreement. We only reach agreement when we find commonality on understanding each other's assumptions, understanding each other's assumptions and fears, rather than saying, I'm right about Brexit because A, B, C, and D, and you're wrong about Brexit because of A, B, and C, and D. It's understanding why people fear Brexit or not, and what assumptions they're making in order to reach those stances. And I always make, as I said earlier on, make very much the emphasis is very much on context and text. Text is what happens within the context, but when you change the context, an entirely different perspective happens. So one needs to always keep that in mind. There is no such thing, in my view, as leadership across contexts. I mean, I was a particularly bad leader, I think, in the technology world, but I was not a bad leader in the media world because it was a different way of expectation that I was being given. And there's always then, in my process, always the ongoing reference and review, as I said, of the original analysis findings so that we can see the progress going on. Some of the issues, just for your information, is that because we're working at this fairly deep developmental level, quite not often, but sometimes psychological issues emerge. I had a client quite recently who after the interview was clearly displaying the symptoms of complex post-traumatic disorder. And I had to say to her, I'm not a therapist. I can't, and I can't look after you in this particular way, but I think you are displaying CPSD symptoms. You need to talk to your therapist. I would suggest you talk to your therapist. And she did. And we were able to work in parallel. But the temptation to then say, well, because I understand what was going on in her childhood, I can work with her, I can develop that, is particularly dangerous, I think. Collusion is the other one, where, and coaches have a problem with this. We all have a problem with this. I think teachers have a problem with this, is that our students, our clients tend to try and protect us. So when they disagree with you, they're quite reluctant to tell you. Not because they're frightened of you, hopefully, but because they do want to protect you. So be careful if you are going to use the interview method, that if they do disagree with you, they must be able to tell you. And hence, I always keep on emphasizing, and I'm sure the coaches amongst you do the same thing, keep emphasizing this dialogue of equals. You are my equal. I'm not here for anything else, any other reason. I have no authority over you, and I don't actually have any special knowledge, but we need to be able to discuss as equals. Over-identification is just falling into the trap. This person came from this particular environment as a child, developed these particular assumptions, latching onto them and not letting that client progress, or not seeing that client's progress, is one thing that you need to be able to guard against. Their opportunities are wonderful because you are working with them to overturn their assumptions and to think about their assumptions. And I think one thing about coach mentoring is it's not just about, is it about leading logically through or enabling logical development? It's also about disruption and helping and guided disruption. And there is an enormous confidence that I see in people when they realize that deeply embedded assumptions, deeply embedded feelings can be unlearned, can be relearned. So that is, and then finally, if you like, the alertness that this requires. I'll just flick through these. These are where it can be used. I use this, by the way, this methodology to help people select leaders and And there is an application that's suggested to me that it is used by colleagues of mine to help conscious experiential learning. So the whole point of the navigational model, as I said, and particularly the partnering stance, is that we are at our most creative and innovative and efficient when we work with the world and not on it. And that can't happen until we know what our foundational assumption about that world is. I just want to finish with just a few seconds of reading a part of the book at the end part of the book that I talk about. And I basically say is, there are very few major political or business leaders who are committed to moving their entire constituencies forward, rather than working with vested interests. There are very few such leaders who continue to burst their leadership bubble by making sure that their challenges are always heard. And there are too many leaders who assume power in opposition to the world rather than working with it to help us all to thrive. Ironically, most such leaders display much more hostility to their own constituents than to their competitors or peers. They brood and rage at the so-called betrayal of criticism and at disagreement or protest from inside their domain, even at the most trivial level. Why? Because their childhood constituencies and their families were where they learned to assume their disparity of power. As adults, oppositional leaders remain trapped by the assumptions and worldviews of children. My hope is that the navigational stance model will help them and us to find true adulthood. Thank you very much. Happy to